Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, the Guillermo del Toro version of Frankenstein came out not too long ago, and I am here with AK Ahab to talk about this great story on both page and screen. Now, there's been a lot of stuff that's been written and published. I'm hearing my voice on your end.
Okay, hold on. I thought I had fixed that, but maybe not. Go. I think the audio is only coming through my headphones.
Okay, so we should be doing better now. Yeah, I'm not
Okay,
hearing the echo anymore. Okay, let me try that
okay.
again. I'm gonna get a clap so I know where to find it. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero. I'm hearing that echo again. Hold on a second. Try talking again?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, I've got my noise cancellation. I've got headphones on, I've got the echo reduction on, and
Yeah, I
I've
don't
got
think
the
it's.
reduced.
Let me test something out. I'm going to open us up on YouTube and see if I'm hearing the problem there. All right, so I'm testing this out. Testing, testing, testing. Okay, I think I understand the problem. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
Um, okay, testing, testing, testing. Can you still hear me pretty well?
Yeah, I can still hear you fine.
Okay, and I'm not echoing anymore on my end, so I think we got it worked out. Good.
Awesome.
One more time. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. It's been a little while since the Guillermo del Toro version of Frankenstein came out on screen, and I am here with returning guest AK Ahab, who has been helping me out with other great stories from literature before, and we're going to talk today about Frankenstein on page and on screen. Now, there have been a lot of great podcasts and articles and things like that have gone into what are the similarities and differences between the book and this movie. And that's not necessarily what we're going to do. Instead, we're going to look at some of the key ethical questions and how are they explored in the book, how are they explored in the movie, and why is there a difference, and which one we feel more compelled by, and all that kind of thing. Looking more at the questions themselves than really trying to do review of either one. So, AK, let me just give you a chance to say hi, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about your experience with Frankenstein.
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm AK. I'm a philosophy graduate student. My experience with Frankenstein. I don't think I read Frankenstein until like a year or two ago. Honestly, it was like one of the classics that I somehow skipped over. But it's like one of my dad's favorite books. He always told me that he
Mm.
really liked the kind of foiled style of the story within the story within the story. So it's like been in the background for a while. I really enjoyed it, although it did take me. It was a book that I got partway through and then stopped for a long time and then went back to. Um, and I didn't see the movie until you reached out about it because I had seen stuff about the movie and then forgotten it existed and didn't get around to watching it. So
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed watching it and kind of returning to the book and rereading portions of the book after watching it. Um, but beyond that, I wouldn't say I've spent a ton of time with it compared to some of the other literature I've spent time with.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, and so talk to us about the book itself. I think there are a lot of people who talk about this book as kind of like the original sci-fi work. Certainly, I think it's one of the most instrumental, one of the original horror works in a lot of ways. Um, Why do you think it is that this book has had such a lasting legacy and that we keep returning to the Frankenstein story on screen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the original story of Frankenstein and the question of the preservation of life and the narrative of how can humans preserve life beyond death, I think is one that has faced, the human condition as long as we've been around. And so like that story um being kind of a really concrete version of that trope told in the context which is told, which is a horror kind of context, I think just becomes really classic on the nature of it calls to humans, right? We all kind of have this desire to live, and medicine pushes often towards the desire to preserve and extend life. But there is always going to be the question of what is too far, what are the ethical obligations that come with the creation of life, and what are the ethical obligations involved in living and in dying. And so, you know, Shelley does a great job writing the story in a way that feels very much like a common moral struggle,
Right.
even within oneself, about what the nature of life is and what our role in life is.
Yeah, I often talk about how the stories that I like most are where it's using the supernatural, it's using science fiction, it's using whatever it is as a metaphor for situations and ethical questions and problems that exist in our own world. And I think this is a great example of that because you said, like, most of us are not mad scientists who are going to try and stitch a body together. I hope not. If you are, well, keep that to yourself. But, as you said, we all have questions about life and death. We've all had questions about what is the meaning of those things, as well as some of the other themes that this is about. The theme of, you kind of talked about it specifically in terms of life and death and medicine. I think it's very true, but also just writ large, the question of what is our relationship to nature and
Hmm.
where is the line between scientific achievement and hubris,
Yep.
and questions about
Hmm.
parentage and parenthood and relationships we have, as and also just the question of the other and
Hmm.
who we judge and how we judge and how the way something looks can affect how we judge something, and what does that mean to judge it then if you don't see the way it looks, and all these kind of questions like that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think one of the really interesting things between the book and this, movie representation of the narrative is that I think they're kind of playing on um very different ends of what those moral questions are. So I'd say like in my read of the book, the question of parentage, and particularly of like the responsibility of individuals in medicine and in parenting was emphasized in a way that was different, because in the movie I felt more of an emphasis on the discussion of the other and how we view the other and how we perceive the other. And so there's still those parenting dynamics and questions, and the question of the relation to like responsibility in regards to raising another person, but it emphasized more in some ways the relationship to like the grotesque other or the monstrous other.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that's always going to happen when you are taking works from such a different time and place. Even just that question of, what is mankind's relationship to science and technology and how much control we have over nature. You know, the things that would have been considered hubristic at the time of Shelley's writing are considered just the most basic. Of course, we can do it science today, and
Right.
some of the challenges they were facing in the Industrial Revolution and stuff like that. That's the context Shelley's writing against, is very different today, and yet, of course, very similar. And you started to bring up some of the stuff about the movie, and like I said, I want to get into specific questions, but we'll start just a little bit general. What did you think of the movie overall in terms of, again, not in terms of quality, but in terms of what you thought was interesting, in terms of what it sort of changed or emphasized differently than the book, or similarly?
Yeah, so I mean, I thought the movie was visually gorgeous. I mean, I think the visual decisions that they're putting on the screen are very in line with a lot of the kind of emphasis that Shelley, I think, was putting on um the visual, in the sense that, the monster is juxtaposed to these sort of beautiful backdrops, and the context of the beauty of the backdrop changes in relation to kind of the emotional moment. I liked the movie a good amount. My biggest kind of thing that I felt was lacking for the movie, and I wouldn't even say lacking. I think the emphasis on the time we spend with Frankenstein, um, creating the monster was really interesting because in the book it's kind of hand waved a little bit. We kind of get montaged through the process by which he creates the monster. And I found the change of him not immediately abandoning the monster quite interesting because,
Yeah.
in the book, he basically makes the monster, goes to bed, wakes up, and runs. And there's little to no interaction between the two of them until much later. Whereas in the movie, he spends a good amount of time with the creature, um, engaging with it in a context that is very, very, very much just not a possibility at all in the book. And it
Right.
changes a good amount of how much and in what way Frankenstein is responsible for the ultimate kind of violent acts of the creature. Because in the
Right.
book, the question of that responsibility is in relation to an abandonment, whereas in the film, the question of that responsibility is relation to a more intentional and directed form of abuse.
Right. And I want to talk about those actions, but just even going back to where you started, I really loved how much more detail the movie went into with the process of building the monster. Especially in terms of the way he gets the body parts, because
Mm-hmm.
to me, one of the things it really shows is that Frankenstein is at this point, I'm not going to call him immoral, but I think amoral is the best
Yeah.
description, in that he
Mm-hmm.
has, like, the scene that really stuck out to me is when he goes to meet with condemned prisoners who are about to be
Mm-hmm.
hung, and he treats them literally like the way you would talk about lab animals. And there's no empathy for, and granted, these are probably, people who've done terrible things, or maybe have not done terrible things. Criminal justice back then was not the best, not that it is today, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but even so, like, whatever else you think about it, like, these are still people who are facing their death. And
Mm-hmm.
he smells one of their breaths and just says, "Oh, you were going to die anyway." And someone else, he says, "Oh, you've got a good back. You'll be a good specimen." And others, he doesn't even talk to them. He talks to his lab assistants about them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a blink and you miss it kind of thing. It's maybe 15 seconds of screen time. But to me, that really highlighted how much, for all of his protestations, about wanting to help humanity and conquer death and all that kind of stuff, this is a person who has no compassion. This is a
Mm-hmm.
person who
Mm-hmm.
is so locked into his scientific pursuit that nothing else matters, and that's really terrifying in a way.
Yeah, and I think they preface that scene, by giving us an insight into his lack of compassion in the scene where he shows the um I guess it's like the school, the progress he's made and the work he's been doing with kind of the upper half of the torso. And like the the body is very clearly experiencing, at least in its initial kind of awakening, like an agony. And then
Right.
it settles and it's interacting and it's a little confused, but there's an interaction happening and then he like unplugs it and it dies another painful, agonizing death. And there's just no consideration of that at
Right.
all. And the school rightfully says like this is crazy. Like you can't be doing
Hmm.
this. And he doesn't, not only does he not hear it, but like you'd think he would care more for his magnum opus that he was like working on and like displaying to these people. You'd think even at an academic level you would care more about like the safety of your, even if it was just an experiment, never mind the fact that it's like a human body that you're reanimating. Um, he's just very flippant about the science that he's doing in general.
Yeah.
And then when we later see him just picking bodies who are still alive, uh, it certainly sinks in that like, oh, these are material for him, and like he is concerned with the material conditions of life.
Right.
Obviously, does not have concern for any of the moral or spiritual or metaphysical, you know, conditions of life.
Right. And I think that's so interesting, especially because, I mentioned how he kind of talks, especially at that symposium, we're sort of on trial with his professors, about the high mindedness of his work. But I think one
Mhm.
thing the movie makes very clear, and I forget how much this is clear in the book, but that in the movie that the daddy issues don't start with the monster, they start with Frankenstein himself and his own father.
Hmm.
And I'll say this is a part that really resonated with me. I had a very rocky relationship with my father for a long time and had to wrestle with the fact that a lot of my motivations to do things was trying to do them better than my father had, and really have to step back and sort of figure out I don't want to do that. Even to the point of for years I wanted to be a father so I could do a better job than my dad, and I happily recognized that long before I had a kid and kind of worked through that and made sure that wasn't going on anymore. But talk to me about how you think that plays a role in it, of in terms of the good Baron doctor being so motivated by his feeling of my father let my mother die. He was a bad doctor. I'm going to show him that I am better. I can conquer death the way my father couldn't.
Yeah. I think it's like it's one of those tragedies of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because what happens in the interaction where the father lets the mother die is also just like a complete disregard for the humanity of the thing that is involved in the act of creation, right? Like women are often just dismissed as vessels by which to bring something into the world. And beyond that, Frankenstein, like Victor's own emotions were completely disregarded in the situation. He was treated as an object for his
Mm-hmm.
father's reputation, he was treated as a vessel for his father's success, and not as a person with wants or needs or desires, or hopes or dreams. And in Frankenstein's attempt to kind of do better than his father on a very technical level, he completely fails to do better than his father on all of those moral and personal levels, which is that, like, really the failing of the dad is not in his career, the failing of the dad is in his personal life. And Frankenstein, in an attempt to outdo his dad's career, completely misses that secondary failure, or at least
Right.
repeats it in himself.
And that was one thing I was trying to remember because I've not read the book before. No, I'm sorry. I have. I've. That was something I was trying to remember. And that was something I was trying to remember because I have read the book before, but it was many years ago, so I don't recall. Is Elizabeth and his kind of romantic infatuation and almost really attempt to seduce her away from his brother, is that a big part of the book?
So in the book, he's engaged to Elizabeth, from a pretty young age, I think. I could be wrong
Mm.
because I read the beginning of the book a good bit ago, and then, like I said, paused and then ended up finishing it earlier this year. But like the I'm pretty sure Elizabeth like comes to live with him when they were young, and then they end up betrothed, and then they're like betrothed the entire time, and he goes back to her and goes back and sees her, and she like loses him to the work is kind of one of the
Right.
things that I think happens, is like she's like, oh, like I had a betrothed and now he's gone off to school, and every time he comes back he's weirder.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really remember the full kind of way that resolves. Like I don't remember if they end up getting married or not. I mean, I know the creature goes back and she ends up also dead at the hands of the creature, but I don't remember how far Victor and her's relationship gets before that happens.
Right. So, what did you think of the change they make of introducing this brother character and having it be this romantic tension between the kind of a love triangle between Victor, his brother, and Elizabeth, and then later with the monster also being thrown in there?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes Elizabeth more of a character. She's much more of a
Mm-hmm.
driving force of the narrative of the movie than she is of the narrative of the book. And she's much more of her own character, certainly, right? Like she's not uh as implicitly tied to Victor and his narrative. She's kind
Mm-hmm.
of doing her own thing and has her own opinions. And I think as a foil against Victor, she works very well as to be someone who's like, oh, I can see the potentiality of humanity in you, but I'm going to call you out for the very inhumane things that you're doing. Um,
Right.
I don't really know what to read of the romantic element between the three of them, just because I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how big of a plot, like how important is it beyond being the plot point that Victor is mad she dies, right? Like,
Right.
um, I think it certainly seems to me, and I think it is the case, given she marries his brother, that she's not as into him as he is into her. Um,
Right.
and I think it's a interesting role. I think it's a compelling role. It certainly felt like it did get a little bit. like squished into the movie that otherwise didn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily have the structure to contain that plot.
Right.
But I don't think it was bad. It was just it was an add-on to Shelley's story that I think was intended to like bring more of a woman's voice into the narrative in contrast to kind of the toxic
Right.
masculinity that's taking place. Um, and I don't think it's poorly executed. It also is not, they didn't want to change too much from the narrative, which I completely understand and behind.
Right.
It was just, it was a nice little addition, but I do think of it as like a little addition.
Yeah, and to me, I think more than anything, it just reflects a Del Toro's kind of sensibilities, but also just how different a time it is that we're telling the story.
Yeah,
Because in a way that I think is very much not necessarily been true at the time that Frankenstein was written,
yeah,
although maybe I could be somewhat wrong. The Dracula story existed a counterpoint, but like monsters weren't sexy necessarily when Shelley was
yeah.
writing in the way that they are today. And I think that Del Toro loves telling stories about monsters as sexual characters. The Shape of Water is another kind of version of this. And I think you don't cast a really handsome actor like Jacob O'Rondy as Frankenstein and then not have someone on screen who recognizes it, who's playing into that sexuality of him. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I kind of agree that it felt to me like it was added, I think, to give her more of a character, which was great, to give a foil to Frankenstein, and also I think to play into the idea of that we now have two people who see a good side to the monster, one in this romantic sexual way, and then one, of course, the stranger in the woods in this kind of companionship friendship way.
Yeah, and I think um the immediate kind of recognition from Elizabeth towards the monster certainly speeds up some of the monster, the creature, the monster's development in the narrative in a way that I think is also very conducive to a film. Like we're able to get a lot more of a understanding of who he is and what he's doing through his interactions with her that in the book takes a really long time to develop in terms of like his emotional and mental development
Right.
in the woods with like the other family. And so like it works really well to show us that no, this is a creature with a duplicity of attitudes and moods and possibilities, and he is pushed towards violence in the movie by violence, but was not inherently there in the first place, which is a little bit of a different narrative than is told in the book because I don't think he's inherently violent in the book either, and he is still
Mm-hmm.
pushed towards violence by violence, but it's not necessarily Victor's violence in the same
Right.
way.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of those deeper questions that the two works are really exploring. And I think one of the things that most comes to mind when you read this book, when you watch these movies, is this question of hubris and the challenge to nature. And, can mankind be, and I say can man, recognizing that sort of thing. And I say, can man conquer his environment? And I say that both kind of because that's the terminology that was used at the time, but also because even though they meant humanity, they were talking mostly about men.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one thing I thought was really well done in the movie that I think is in the book as well, um, starting out the story and as you said, it's a story within a story about this ship that is frozen in the
Mm-hmm.
ice that is trying to get to the North Pole,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and the men saying we need to turn around, we need to go back, and the captain saying no, we're going to do this, even though all indications are that nature has defeated him. And to me, that is such a metaphor of the whole story we're about to hear, right?
Yeah, I mean, as a Moby Dick fan, it's very we've done a podcast on this before, but to me, it's what happens when you have man with Ahab like tendencies who has a goal in mind who just wants to push, 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 and the meta narrative is actually that push gets interrupted by the story of Frankenstein, and then they turn around
Right.
and go home. Um, and what I like about the book that I think is missing from the movie is that because what causes the creature's violence is not Frankenstein's direct parenting or raising of the creature, but his turning it loose into the environment. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what we get is a narrative where man's hubris is also that he doesn't feel responsibility for his creations or his
Right.
involvement in the world because he turns it loose And then by nature of the fact that humanity is flawed and the world is flawed and the environment is flawed, the kinds of flawed and toxic and violent inclinations are just what the creature is exposed to, and so what he becomes. Whereas, the alternative would be a loving and kind and caring parent who helps you navigate the world and learn that no, these violent, horrible things are not the way it has to or needs to be. Um, and so to me, that narrative about the relationship to nature is about a certain sense of responsibility. Whereas in
Yeah.
the film, I think the relation to nature is much more, uh, I guess it's about a responsibility to not cause harm rather than a responsibility to foster goodness. And I would say that maybe that's a differentiation that I spot between the two of them, because I think the
Mm.
implicit suggestion of Shelley in the book is no, you can't just do nothing, you have to do something. Whereas in the film, because Victor is so intimately violent towards the creature, the message ends up being more in the direction of, I think, don't be violent rather than being
Right.
caring. Um,
Right.
and in relation to nature, I think in the movie, there's much more of a the creature is acting kind of vengefully in relation to nature, like the elemental components of where the creature finds itself and how it responds to Victor in these like kind of passive storm like ways, like these just big waves of response, is in its own right very compelling and very interesting, and I think very in line with the fact that like you can create and can make all kinds of things, and at the end of the day they're gonna act in their own ways, that cannot be predicted, and I think all of that is very valuable, but it is different than what I see in the book.
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from there, and I think the the movie, I I think especially that framing of the captain, where he just doesn't seem to care that his men don't want to go on and that his men are dying. It's to him all about that goal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think in the same way with Frankenstein, and you're right, there isn't as much the sense of that. The responsibility is there, but not. It's more about like the consequences of your actions rather than like what are the what have you created and put out into the world, and how is that coming
Mm-hmm.
back to you? Because you know, for me, part of what makes the story of the monster so tragic is that the way it reacts to its world is actually not very different from any like just born creature.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a recent parent, as most of my listeners know. I have a child who's now 6 months old, and we do our best to take care of him and be there for him at all times and take care of his needs. But there are times when he's really really angry,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it's because we just gave him a vaccine shot, or because he dropped his bottle and he doesn't have it and we're not picking it up on time, or because he's really really tired and he doesn't understand that if he stops yelling about how tired he is and goes to sleep, the point is he's very angry, and but he's tiny. There's no doubt, like it's okay, we can soothe his anger and we're also not in any danger from his anger.
Mm-hmm.
The monster is that exact same set of emotions on a 10-foot tall creature that has the strength of 100 men or whatever
Mm-hmm.
it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that that plus, as you kept talking about, you know it, the monster is lashing out because of all the people who've lashed out at him.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, there's so much in his story about how like people who've been abused grow up to abuse people themselves, and hurt people and stuff like that. And that, yeah, when people when you see just like the number of times he's trying to help someone, but people just look at what he is and what he looks like and immediately assume he's a threat and therefore want to harm him, of course he's going to fight back against that world.
Yeah. I also think there's an element, I mean, and we've talked about disability a lot before. I mean, it's hard to read Frankenstein or any version of the story without considering at least some of the disability implications. I mean, he's a body
Yep.
built from corpse. Um, One of the things that I think the movie shows very well is that the prioritization of certain physical abilities and the way that that is carried out often causes some trade-off in your emotional stability. And
Mm-hmm.
we've seen this, globally with like I think about Olympic athletes in like Soviet Russia who were horribly mistreated, or even, like pageants in the United States for young children. There are lots of conditions where we push certain physical standards or conditions or abilities on people and then are shocked and frightened by the emotional response with what we've created and the gaps we've created and the ways we've disabled people by forcing certain physical conditions upon them on the assumption of ability. And I think the creature being so strong and physically able in one sense, and on the other sense being completely vulnerable and in need of care and consideration in the mental capacity because it's a child,
Right.
is a really, I think, powerful demonstration of the way that, like, access needs trade off in two directions, and an overemphasis on attention to kind of one physical or mobility consideration can often cost the other quite gravely.
Yeah. Do you know the story of Mice and Men? Either the book
Yes.
or any of the screen adaptations.
Yes.
To me, that's part of what I think about that is that the character of Lenny is very
Mhm.
much that same kind of idea of he's the gentle giant. He's
Mhm.
very large and very strong, and I think you know Steinbeck is writing at a time where we don't understand this condition the way we do today, but he is what I think we would call today developmentally disabled.
Mhm.
He does not have the intellectual capacity that a lot of other folks do, and and so he winds up in a situation where he's talking to a woman and he's trying to interact with her the best way he understands, but he does it in a way that she finds physically threatening, and I think she very understandably reacts poorly to that. I think actually in the book she's kind of teasing him a little bit, but still I don't like
Yeah.
it's not her fault necessarily by any means, but she kind of is upset about that, and he panics and is trying to calm her down, not aware of his own strength, and kills her.
Mhm.
And to me, that's very much the monster there of
Mhm.
that same idea of the the giant that doesn't know his strength. And
Mhm.
in a Mice and Men, there's this whole story about like how much is the responsibility of his friend like to kind of prevent him that from happening. And Lenny's a full grown adult. Like we don't know what his background has been like, but certainly with the monster, we know, like you said, Frankenstein had this chance to try and teach him, try and like help him learn how to exist in the world. But I think because Frankenstein doesn't see this as a sentient being that I'm going to raise, he sees this as I want it to be a successful iteration of my work.
Mhm.
And when it's not, he gets frustrated and he yells at him and he hits the monster and he demands that he say the word Victor and all this kind of stuff. And just, yeah, it becomes incredibly abusive.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, like, part of Victor's disappointment in the film is certainly the lack of intellectual capacity with the creature. Like, he's mad that he won't say more than Victor, that he is seemingly a quote like dumb brute, right? So
Right.
he like relishes the physical capacity of the creature and is utterly disappointed at the mental capacity of the creature and then justifies like chaining him up in the basement. And that's also something that's incredibly common in the history of disability, was like
Right.
individuals who were developmentally disabled being perceived inherently as a threat because they had bodies and were unpredictable, or particularly in conditions that were already violent, particularly in conditions that were already triggering. And so the solution to these people's existence was to just put them away somewhere and never
Right.
try and engage with them again. Um, and that does, it breeds violence. Like, that's when those people end up in the world later in life, they were often violent because that you could build violence into someone, especially someone who's already like mentally disabled and
Yeah.
subject to certain forms of manipulation. Like, that's just something that does happen. But then that violence gets blamed on the individual who is enacting it out in the world in a physical sense, and not on the individuals who created the conditions for that violence to arise.
Right. And that's why I think the story of the old man in the forest who befriends the monster is so powerful because here
Yeah.
I kind of mentioned before that um, one of the things we're exploring here is how much our sense of the monstrous is the visual, and that the monster in Frankenstein's case looks monstrous,
Hmm.
but isn't in any other capacity. And that I think it's really important that when he meets this old man in the forest, who first thinks of him as the nature spirit, and becomes realize he's just another person, doesn't see him as monstrous because he's blind, and just therefore relates to him.
Mhm.
Now he develops intellectual capacity. He learns to
Mhm.
read. He learns to philosophize. He learns to think. And I think it's really it's a sign of Victor's failure that, here's someone who uses a carrot instead of a stick, and it works. And it,
Mhm.
it's the failure that proves the success, is that Victor
Mhm.
did build a creature that could have intellectual capacity, but he just didn't know what to do with it in order to get it there
Right. I
because
mean,
he couldn't get
he
out of his
had
own way.
well, he had no concept of how to like accommodate a child, right? Like in any
Right.
way, shape, or form. In part because of the failing of his own parent, right? He treats the creature the way that his parent treated him, and that's all he knows how to do. So we also have this representation of kind of the way that generational violence and trauma is carried out, which again is very compelling. What it lacks in terms of the book, I go back to, is I think the book is really interesting in that it says like actually, if left unattended, the nature of like hierarchical masculine society is to create conditions of violence, and so you don't even need the direct relation to any sort of history because the history is going to catch up to you, like that it's
Yeah.
out in the world regardless of what your parent relationship is like. Regardless of how you're thrown into the world is going to teach you violence in certain ways, and like you have to preempt that or it comes. Whereas in Frankenstein, they're showing us how it happens, which well, the film Frankenstein, which is also incredibly valuable, but the fact that they're building that up, um, you know, I also think is a product of the fact that we much better understand these things from like a social and psychological level as a society now, that telling the
Mm-hmm.
story in that way um, is going to actually reach more people, I think.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I think part of the challenge, I think, when you're adapting works from long ago, is how do you find what the message was, and then how
Mm,
do you update that for today?
right.
And I think it's a real challenge that a lot of things wrestle with, and often I think there can be an attempt to be so true to the original that you're telling a story that doesn't make sense anymore.
Right.
And so I do
Yeah.
think, and I think people can talk about whether this is the most faithful adaptation and whether other versions are better, and that's legit. And again, that's not really what this podcast is. Excuse me. But I think that the choices Del Toro made, for me, help to bring those points into another way of understanding them from the modern day.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I love about particularly canonical, works in any culture is that they do get retold. Like humans, I think often, especially in contemporary media, we think about stories as being told once and being done. But the tradition of folklore and mythology and history has always been one where there are different regional tellings of stories to fit the context of those regions and those times. And so I think what we see as we move forward in history and we have more particularly like contemporary works by women and contemporary works by Americans, in a America quotation marks, is
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing some of these stories get adapted to screen in a variety of ways that are not going to be completely faithful to the source material, because that's not how storytelling works.
Yeah.
Because you retell the story in different ways for different moments, and that's always been part of the human condition.
I mean, one thing I think is fascinating is how much one thing I think is fascinating is how many robot stories
Mm-hmm.
wind up being versions of the Frankenstein story when it's a story about, humans creating these beings for the use of humans and then having to wrestle with, what have they made the robots into? Whether it's like,
Mm-hmm.
we make AI and then don't realize it's going to become a threat and kind of like the Terminator idea. Or like, do you ever watch the show Battlestar Galactica?
I've seen a little bit of it. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic show. We can debate the ending. A lot of people don't like it. I'm definitely one of them. But, they that I think is pretty explicitly a Frankenstein story. One
Yeah.
of the taglines is "Mankind's children have returned home." That they made these robots, that the robots gained sentience, and then when humans couldn't deal with it, they abandoned them. In this case, they just kind of fought with them and then exiled them. And now they've come back to try and wipe out humanity, much like the monster, because that's all they know.
Right. Because that's all right, because that's all it was shown. And I think there is like what I appreciate about Frankenstein in that it's not a robot story, and which I toggle between my feelings and opinions about the visual effect of the creature in this film. But one of the things that I think is um, particularly potent about Frankenstein in this current moment is we're at a point where we're no longer just talking robots, like we are actually talking the integration between scientific elements and human biology for the preservation of life. And there are multiple people in the world studying and worrying about that right now. And there is something different that happens when you're talking about a human body, which is that you have to look at the human bodies that are alive. And so the
Right.
scene that you talked about earlier, where Frankenstein is at the prisons, like going through people and selecting people, is resonates in a much more immediate way in a world where we have genuine concerns about who are the people that we're testing things like Neuralink on. Like,
Right.
what is the status of these individuals? Like, are they actually choosing this of their own free will? Are they being viewed as humans or subjects? Um, in a way that the robot story, because you're building a robot from things that are not sentient and eventually become sentient, whereas you have to build a human from something that is already biological,
Right.
uh, has a different kind of immediacy. And I think it has an immediacy that grounds us in the question of the human rather than trying to escape the question of the human and then have it turn
Mm-hmm.
around and confront us.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good point, and I think I think it's really striking that Victor starts in this perspective of wanting to capture death, of wanting to
Mm-hmm.
conquer death, of wanting to bring someone back who has died. And yet, what he then does is to create, he doesn't wind up finding a way to preserve existing life, it is to create new life
Right,
in a way where it's like, well, we actually can do that, Victor.
right,
We figured out a way to do that. Childbirth isn't very safe, but it happens. It happens a lot. And so you sort of wonder, like, let's say he's successful. Okay, well, hopefully from that we can now learn we can learn great new things about life and how to sustain it and go in new ways. But like the addition of even an intellectually capable, friendly Frankenstein's creature
right,
doesn't help anybody who's sick.
right. And um, it's just the creation of something new for the sake of creating something new. And
Right.
it's not actually like the fact that he cuts up so many bodies and that he composites so many pieces of different bodies. It's so clearly an attempt at optimization in a way that I also think speaks to a lot of the debates, which have, you know, I think swelled 5 to 10 years ago and have now died out a little bit. But the CRISPR debates about the optimization of the human genome and what we can do in
Mm-hmm.
terms of modification, like Victor's decision to take the optimal pieces of every body and build in his brain what is the perfect subject, um, falls flat at being a subject that is like engaged in the world the way he wants the subject to be engaged in the world, because he's so clearly viewing it as a machine. Um,
Right.
and it's like, yeah, that mechanical component of the human biology is interesting, but to what degree are we helping people versus optimizing people?
Right.
And like, what are the actual benefits of optimization for the human body? Like, can you actually even claim that there is an optimal version of a human body?
Right. Well, it becomes very ableistic. It becomes very um, focused on, it can become, very racially defined in terms of what are like proper body components and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about some of the kind of the ways this was popping up just years ago. Right now, this is popping up in terms of the whole, it's still pretty much an underground thing, but it's growing, and I think it's really horrifying connotations of the ability to create, the AI girlfriend, where,
Mm-hmm.
they will interact with you, they will send you erotic pictures and stuff like that. And part of it is you get to design their body. And
Yeah.
I was reading an article that was talking about how, like, yeah, in some of them you get to, like, I want to have, the chest of someone like this, and the butt of someone like this, and the legs of some, and it's that sewing together of body parts in
Mm-hmm.
this case in a cyber realm, but it's still the same idea, and that's
Yeah.
it's not.
and it's
Good.
ultimately for the commodification of that body, right? It's
Right.
for all of those bodies as physical parts and not as anything living or to be cared for or to be taken care of or to even sense or engage in the world. Like that's not the way that you're viewing those body parts. You're viewing them as strictly for your consumption.
Yeah. There's a way of describing the world that I really like, and it's kind of referring back to a 19th century German philosopher, a Jewish philosopher, 19th and 20th century, Martin Buber. But the way I hear it best described in kind of modern geek terms is like, do you see the world as other player characters or as other non-player characters? You know,
Right.
because a player character is someone else with their own motivations and things. A non-player character literally exists in the role-playing game or the video game just to help you advance your plot. They don't have their own interiority. They don't have their own, and I think that's what Victor wrestles with. Is his father wanted him not to have his own interiority, but just to be a prop to help his
Mhm.
reputation. And Victor wants the same thing from the monster.
Yeah, and I think, they go even further with Victor in that it's not just that he wants the same thing for the monster, he wants the same thing from Elizabeth and from his brother. And it costs
Yeah,
both of them.
yeah,
Like
you're right.
his brother does all the heavy lifting in the creation of the lab, like literally all of the heavy lifting.
Mm-hmm.
Victor says, "Here's the plans," screws off.
Right.
And like he has an interest in what they can immediately provide to him and what their bodies can produce for him and no consideration for their being in the world beyond that.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. Well, this has been a great discussion, AK. Is there any other last things you want to bring up or points we haven't touched on yet?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, for those who are hearing you for the first time or want to hear more of you, where can people find your writings or stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm on uh, Instagram at Iron Kingdom Adventures and TikTok at Iron Kingdom Adventures, and then I'm on Twitter as AKA Hab.
Awesome. Awesome. Definitely check that out. Of course, if you go to theethicalpanda.com, you'll find all the old episodes of this podcast, of my other podcast, Star Wars Generations, as well as all the ways to contact us. Let us know what you think. We love doing feedback. We love hearing from you. Please send us your thoughts, email, Twitter, TikTok, carrier pigeon, whatever works. On behalf of myself and AK, thank you so much for tuning in. May the force be with you. All right, and we're out.